Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 492 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'll welcome back Doug Peltzman. A few years ago, he made a major shift in his studio practice, essentializing his approach to surface design to create a new aesthetic. In our interview, we talk about following the kernel of an idea and re-engaging your customers after a major shift in the studio. To see examples of his work, you can visit dougpeltzman.com. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to do a few plugs up top here. I'm having a merch sale, which includes our brand new long sleeve t-shirt hoodies. If you'd like to get 20% off your order, you can use the offer code RedClayRambler at talesofaredclayrambler.com/shop. Also wanted to mention that I'll have new work available in my shop this weekend. That's at carterpottery.com, and I've got a new batch of pots including mugs, pitchers, bowls, all the usual suspects. So make sure to check that out. Again, the website for that is carterpottery.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So I wanted to start thinking about the aesthetic shift you had about maybe 3 years ago, where you went from making highly decorated work to also decorated work, but in a very different aesthetic. So can you talk about how that shift happened?
It's interesting to try to go back and reflect because at the time it looks so abrupt, right? Like in the course of Instagram and how things, I guess, kind of can be viewed. But I guess it happened pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. I had been, I can remember distinctly. Uh, I believe it was 2017 or 2018, having sort of um, an epiphany about my work um, after doing after doing shows where you go and set up a lot of pots, right? And so, when you go to a show like the Old Church Pottery Show or Flower City or these shows where you bring 100, 150 pieces and you put them all on a table and you see your work as a group, uh, you know, that to me was really telling. It was like visual overload. It was like there was so much information on one pot. And then when all the information was together on a table of pots, it became like, for me, like it just looked like a blur, you know? And I used to feel so good, like I'd unload these kilns, and I had a lot of problem with glazes, all throughout that work where things would blister and I'd grind and refire and save pots all the time because there was so much effort and time put into each piece. So I didn't want to just like, cast them aside and call them a second. I wanted to try to make those pots work. And so, you put together a body of work that was just so time consuming, and this is regardless of what the work meant to me and the imagery and the symbology, just the labor, and feel really good about it, pack it all up and then go display it, and you're like, huh, or and you're kind of next to somebody's work, like just to throw, for a reference point, like Julia Galloway or Ellen Shankin, and you just see the sort of uh you know the level of um harmony that's created there, and how the work kind of you know really kind of flows together as a body of work. And I'm not saying mine didn't, and I'm not saying it wasn't beautiful. But what I am saying, it was like overwhelming to me visually. And so as a reaction to that, I went to, and I would test this out at shows, and through, through being with Objective Clay, which is this clay co-op I was a part of for 10 years, we'd go to NCECA and we'd set up a gallery, and that was different because we would set all our work up together and it wouldn't be so much work, and that was kind of a free for all, a frenzy. People would come and buy pots, and pots would thin out really quickly. So and it was, and next to everybody else's work. So it was really hard to get a sense of your own work. But I think it was like 2017. I'm not sure. But I went to Art of the Pot, which is a show in Texas, and I was Lisa Orr's guest, and we set up our work in her driveway, and it was really cool. And she had an amazing house there, and she's just so full of energy and knowledge, and she's amazing. Um, but I decided for that show that I was going to make my pots, but I wasn't going to draw on any of them. I wasn't going to do any inlay. They were just going to be my pots, dipped, not dipped in just colors, just oof, color pops. And I wanted to see, does this work hold up? Do people still care about my work without all the information? And I really enjoyed how it looked. And it was all porcelain still at that point, really bright, the same bright glazes I had been using. Um, just like, one glaze on a pot, maybe two, with, my handles. Some of them might have had gold luster on them. They were still involved pots and dynamic, but they just didn't have all the busy kind of busy work. And I bombed, I really bombed, in the sense that people didn't really buy those pots. I didn't sell too many of them there. Eventually they all sold down the line, kind of what happens. Um, I think if you, I always had this in my head, like if you believe in the work you're doing enough and show people that you love what you're doing, then people will buy into that love, you know, and that kind of, so that was like the beginning of the change, or me thinking that I needed to shift. And it wasn't just like seeing my work in a group and being like, for lack of a better word, like, you know, uncomfortable about it or disgusted. Um, but like, there were multiple things happening. Like it was also sitting down in the studio and being surrounded by dust all the time. And, because when you're carving in that way, you're creating a lot of like little dust, um, and, and also like just, you know, this is pretty broad, but just, you know, like the joy that I once felt in the process. And I'm not saying that unloading those pots don't give me joy, because they do. Um, like last year, I made a batch of these black porcelain pots, and they were torture to make. I kid you not. And they were very expensive, which is another kind of like, thing that I'm slightly uncomfortable with. But when I open up the kiln and see those pots, like that is when I feel like it's all worth it with that work. But with this new stoneware body of work and the sort of freshness and not no, not freshness, but I guess s- um, spontaneity, uh, speed at which I can make pots. Um, I started to find the joy again in the process. Like, we all always talk about process and how important process is, and how I really do love every aspect of ceramics. Um, I'm one of those people like who like every step of the way, whether it's formation, trimming, the sound of grog or sand cutting through soft clay, and then moving into the glazing, you know, you know, the glazing component and all of those things. Like if I didn't spend 10 years developing that porcelain body of work, and then, so many things happened in the middle. There was a ram press that was bought. I mean, we can get into that too. Um, but I would not be making the work I'm making now, right? Like everything is on a continuum. Everything is a response to the thing that I've made before, the thing that I'm making now, and the thing that I want to make. It's hard to sometimes, put all that into words and really, wrap your head around what all that means. And even pottery too, like people want to know, like, what is your, often it's like, what are you trying to say with this piece? And, I feel like potters are much like musicians in that so much of what we do is like a musical note. And it's a combination of these musical notes that make a song. And often that song has maybe some sort of meaning or message, but often it doesn't. It's just some sort of, like, to quote Bob Dylan, it's some sort of penetrating magic. It's like, the process reveals a sequence of words or a sequence of marks that you make that then becomes your thing, or then, you know, becomes a body of work, and it's sometimes really hard to nail all that down, especially if you're really um, an obsessive, if you're really, I think all of us artists, potters, are obsessives in some way, like over making good work, to say it as simply as possible.
Well, I want to go back to the moment you're at the Art of the Pot sale, and that first deviation from the porcelain work is, as you mentioned, it bombed. Like it didn't have the audience there that it eventually would have as you kept evolving. But I know, because of the financial pressures of being a working potter, when there's failure, I often tighten up. But what seems to happen is that through that moment of failure, you actually loosened up even more. And it's not that, I mean, it's funny. Your pots I would not think of as being as a traditionally loose pot, but your approach to making, where you're improvising with color, improvising with surface, improvising with pattern, that seems like it got looser after Art of the Pot, not got tighter. So how how did you keep yourself from tightening up when you didn't when you might have had the expectation that you wanted the pots to sell better?
Yeah, that's a great point. So one thing that I've always sort of kicked myself in the foot about, is that the right saying? I don't know. But like, is that uh, I've been supporting my family off the sales of my pots and teaching workshops for the last 10 years. Okay, since I pretty much got out of graduate school. That's the our income. My wife was doing the harder job of being with the kids full time over the past, um, well, I should say 12 years. And recently that's changed. My wife, who's a really good potter, um, uh, started full-time work as a chocolate maker, which is a whole other conversation. But like, so some of those pressures are lifted. But I guess what I'm getting at is that I never allowed the financial pressure to dictate my work. And that has also a lot to do with family support. Not saying I was being bankrolled by my parents or my in-laws, but if we needed help, it was there, right? We were always able to pay our bills and get by, but something major, whatever it might be. But so, that's a privileged place, I understand, but I also, would say this in workshops jokingly, that my kids are like really important, but the integrity of my work is like almost right there. I mean, I think more now they're the new work that I make has allowed me to prioritize them way more than the work, because it's not even in the same hemisphere as far as labor is concerned. You know, by that I mean like just sitting down, hunched in a ball with a pot and carving it for hours, right? Um, so but that freedom, you know, and that not like allowing myself to freak out came, I believe, from having a RAM press in my studio. And so in 2016, we moved here, and I live right in the southern foothills of the Catskill Mountains, about 20 minutes west of Kingston, New York, near Woodstock. And this is where we are. We planted our flag here, and right around that Art of the Pot time, I invested heavily into a 30-ton RAM press. Why? People, again, another thing that people are like, what are you doing? You know, this 3,000 pound, 2,400 pound piece of equipment that, was hell getting it here and into my studio. And then I spent a year teaching myself how to make dyes, which are essentially molds, like water release molds that you make pressed objects with, that get bolted to this. Essentially, it's like a log splitter, is how I would describe it. It's a big hydraulic piston that compresses clay and makes pots. Um, I don't even know why I wanted one. I taught at Auburn University in 2012 for a year, and the former professor there there were ram presses in the studio. He was an architectural ceramicist, and he taught there for 30 years. And I don't know if ram pressing was part of the program much, but he did it for his own work. His name was Gary Wagner or Wagoner. I might be butchering that, but he taught at Auburn, and so he had given me this thick book, 100-page book. Like, if you buy a ram press, you get this book. Okay. The information is proprietary. You can really not search the internet and learn how to make a die. It's really difficult to find the information. And so I just started thumbing through this book, which is cool because the drawings are all from like the 70s, but you can figure it out. I can talk for the RAM press for an hour, but we won't. But so I spent a year figuring out this technology, and then spent the next 2 or 3 years making pots on this machine. And the reason I wanted it is because I figured it was, I started making faceted cups, and I love the panels that a faceted cup gave me. I was able to draw. Most often they were even numbers, so they had 8 panels, and my drawings and the designs that I would create on the pots were able to shift. I was able to create a panel with, for example, dashed horizontal lines, and maybe the next panel had dashed vertical lines, and I would shift these panels and colors and play with them. And I had been making those by hand, so I was throwing and then faceting and then honing and honing and honing and getting the size right. And I thought, wow, like, I should slip cast these. And then I did, and I was involved in in Ayumi's Democratic Cup object, and they were slip casting them. I was paired up with Michelle Summers. It's a really cool faceted cup. But what I didn't like from the thrown object to the cast one was that the octagonal shape on the outside was then on the inside. Right? What I loved about the throne was that the inside was round and the outside was octagonal, or a dodecahedron, or it was 12-sided, whatever. And so I just did my, and I'm like, wow, a RAM press is like the only thing that can do this. So I really, went and spent like, $10,000 and invested, and like, because this machine was the only thing that can make this cup. Right? And I wanted to fill tables with these cups and just, draw on them and just see where it went. And so this super rigid, super industrial process that is for industry to make restaurant ware and, mass produced things, for me became the ultimate freedom It was also an albatross, but it was also super freeing. And I say it was an albatross because the molds are hundreds of pounds, and I needed a hoist in my studio, which is the hoist is still hanging there, but the press is gone. Um, you know, and once the mold is on the machine and you're putting clay in it and you're popping objects out, then it's like, and you demo that for people, and they're like, it's like watching, somebody throw for the first time when you see an object come off that machine. And there's steam, when the object pops off, because the air, the molds are encased with mold duct tubing, which is attached to air compression, and that compressed air pushes water to the surface, which releases the mold. So the mold has a porosity to it. If your listeners don't understand any of the stuff I'm saying, just Google it, and you can see videos of people popping objects. You'll probably see videos of me, maybe. So I would fill a table with these pots, and then I started dipping them in slip and doing, finger paintings, and, doing things I just wouldn't have done if I didn't have a table filled with 50 mugs or 50 plates. And then I started making molds of square plates with square feet, because to make a square plate with a square foot by hand is super hard, right? But to make a mold of it, and then you start pressing them out, and then the plates became canvases for me, right? And then it removed the preciousness of those objects, because if one did fail, all right, so what? It was like it took the time for me to prepare the clay and get the clay to the right consistency, because you're not using clay that's the same consistency of thrown clay. The clay is pretty firm. The objects aren't coming off the mold leather hard, but they're on their way, you know? And so that was all happening and swirling at the same time, right? And then, there was, I think I did American Pottery Festival in 2018 or 2019. I took a couple trips to Minnesota, and Sika was in Minnesota that year too. Visited studios, and I had been, like most of us in undergraduate school 20 years ago, you worked in earthenware or you worked in stoneware. And there was buckets on one side of the room that were low fire glaze buckets, buckets on the other side of the room that were for reduction cone 10 reduction gas. And that was the aesthetic you were exposed to, you know. That was what we were exposed to at SUNY New Paltz anyway, when I finally, after, you know, being a painting, getting a degree in painting and then going back to school for ceramics, like, okay, like, this is what we have. And then, and then getting involved in wood firing, and then graduate school took me to the work that I became, somewhat known for, that we're discussing here. And then, these trips to Minnesota in 2018, 2019, being like, huh, we call this stoneware, and then right around that time, somebody up in Schoharie, New York, about 45 minutes northwest of me, was selling this old Bailey gas kiln. And things were lining up. And I thought, and my wife, who, if people know us well and well enough, and friends who are potters who have come stayed here, know the power of Pam's pots, and they know that, her work's not out in the world, but she had a defined voice in undergrad. And people like that, like just naturals, people you see touch clay and they're speaking their own language right away. Or in some, once they have a basic skill level, they have a language with clay. I had to go to graduate school to figure that out and really learn how to read again, or learn how to read, because I resisted reading all through childhood, and and figure out arguments for my work and whatever it might be. But certain people just have a way with the material. And she had always, when we left Penn State in 2010, we switched everything to Cone 8 electric. Her glazes went from Cone 10 reduction to Cone 10, very involved with cone 10 reduction porcelain. So anyway, we always wanted to get back to reduction firing. So all these things presented themselves at a time where my work felt like it was in in a deep state of change, and it was like ready. And so the kiln came, then testing came, and then the work is still coming, from all that. So that's kind of a long story, but that's kind of how it has fleshed out. And then you take all those experiences and what you essentially have acquired. I feel like all we as potters do over time, if you're in it long enough, is create um, this deep well of a vocabulary that you can draw from. Some things you forget about and you see old pot and go, oh yeah, I did that. I can try that again. Or it's like some things never leave you and they're like part of your sort of food bank or your memory bank of things you use. Um, and so as much as I like to think that my work has dramatically shifted, being the same person I am as a baby and to now, I know I've changed, but I know in many ways I'm the same. In many ways, my work is the same too. Like I still look at color the same way as a way to counterpoint it's like a color theory. It's like my background in painting is just revealing itself in ceramics. Like I'm, you know, putting odd color combinations together just because I'm looking at them as color, not as glaze. You know, um, I had a great conversation with a potter this weekend at Pottery on the Hill. It was like your glaze, like your pots are stoneware and they have a certain aesthetic, but the glazing is so odd. And this is like in a positive way that you wouldn't assume those colors would work together or go together, but it's hard to place historically and contemporarily because of some of that stuff. Even though some of the glazes might be like Warren Mackenzie glazes or Val Cushing glazes, I don't know. I'm just using them in the only way I know how to use them, which is as color.
Well, your sense of color reminds me of skate fashion because there was always, at least in the 90s, when I was skating when I was younger, you would have like a base color and then you'd have really bright pop of color that was not in the same color family. So it's like having like a melody in music and then an electronic beat that's like boom, like over the top of it.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Well, when I look at a bunch of your pots, there'll be like some oranges, some blue, and then there'll be yellow, like really bright yellow. So it
Yeah.
makes me, it reminds me of that sense of almost like a renegade sense of color. Like, oh, you're expecting it to be this, but I'm going to change your expectation by the way I use that color.
Yeah, yeah. And then on top of that, you have like just the raw phenomenology of glaze, right? Like what glaze is just doing a kiln. And that's one of the things that's super exciting about like atmospherically firing again or just gas firing is just that sense of fusion between clay and glaze that are happening. And those two things becoming one and not being like I used to always use the analogy of like porcelain for me was like watercolor. Like when I used to paint, like watercolor paper is so important to watercolor. And porcelain is super important to the transparencies that I was putting on it. But you could see the separation there. They weren't like, there wasn't a fusion there. One was a backdrop and one was the color on it. But yeah, the skateboarding thing is funny. Like I skateboarded, I still skateboard. My son actually, my 12-year-old just finally grasped the ollie. And,
Nice.
after sort of like skating as like a 5 and 6-year-old and then just kind of letting it go. And now he's super athletic. And this is my oldest. I have 3 kids and, now just like really committing himself. I want to learn how to ollie, which is super cool to see. Because I started around 12. But yeah, that was my first, without knowing it, art experience. Going into a skate shop seeing a wall of skateboards and picking one out. And it's a lot like picking a pot out when you think about it, because skateboards are all different shapes. They're concave. The tail and the nose are of different angles. The nose, modern skateboards now is a little bit bigger than the tail. Back then, it was like opposite, um, or it was like actually in the early 2000s, the nose and the tail were kind of the same size, I think. But like the feel of it under your feet was super important, just like the feel of a handle is really, really important, right? And I had a guy in Pottery on the Hill telling me that there are no handles in this building that are good for him. And I'm like, dude, you're like amongst some of the best potters in the country. And that's super offensive. But like, and then we started talking about his arthritis and all these
Oh,
other
yeah, yeah.
sort of things at play. But like, I was like, wow, like, but like, yeah, but like that. So that combination of the way something looks and the way it feels and how that's super specific to everyone is why pottery to me, and also the choice of picking out a skateboard, are two very similar things. And then also looking at it aesthetically, like the silk screened art, like those are art objects. Granted, some of it's really bad art. Um, but as a kid, as like a 12-year-old, you don't know that. You see fluorescent pink and green and some crazy, you know, you know, like face with a tongue hanging out, or, whatever it was. Like I remember my first skateboard. It was a New Deal John Montesi skateboard, and the art was super weird and like, but I remember it so vividly. Um, and that was my first, like my parents weren't artists. There was no value of art like that in my household. Food was important, meals were important, just as like growing up in a very Jewish household, like in that regard, like traditions and whatnot. But like, um, but as far as art, yeah, skateboards. There's no doubt. And that only came from like going to graduate school and thinking back you know, on childhood and realizing like, and that's why being a parent, I feel like, is so profoundly important. And also like heartbreaking when you see children in pain around the world, is because we those years are so formative, and they make you the artist you are, for good or for bad, like if those were negative experiences, well, then that stuff is going to shape you. If they were, whatever, positive joys and traumas, like all that stuff is getting mashed up and it's making you, uh, who you are. And so, like thinking back on it, I feel so like I rejected everything. I rejected organized sports. I was never on a team. I was never, all I did from the time I was 12 until I broke a lot of bones in my early 20s was skateboard every single day. And the skateboarding not only was like the visually aesthetic thing, but it was the discipline of being an artist. It was the beating yourself. It's so funny, like, and I don't know if everybody understands this, but skateboarding is like any sport, but it could be maybe a little more. I mean, maybe football's pretty brutal, but like skateboarding, you're not hitting into other people. You're not trying to hurt other people. You're only hurting yourself, and you're doing it over and over and over again, you know, whether it's learning how to ollie or learning how to kick foot, but you could learn how to kick foot for weeks and weeks and weeks and miss that trick hundreds and thousands of times and then land it once and experience that joy for 1 second, and it's worth it. And that kind of thing is rare, especially, for kids that are nowadays being pulled in so many, directions, as far as like, I guess we were too as kids. Like, I watched a lot of TV, played a lot of video games, but I think it's different now. I think there's a more insidious sort of corporate takeover that's happening of the minds of Americans in general. Um, you know, I'm reading a book now all about how that focus is being stolen from us and how we need to reclaim it. But yeah, like that level of intensity at a young age is was profoundly important for why I make pots, and why I can, make pots on a bad day, make pots on a good day, and just always be, you know, working through something to get somewhere, and understanding that it's all about the process, and that even when you get to that thing, the work still there's still going to be work to be done, you know. And that's why when you see a potter or somebody making pots at the age of 94, you're like, okay, this is it. Unless you're, I mean, everybody's wired different. Some people, you're going to wake up one day and, I think about Bob Briscoe in this instance. Like, he retired. You could retire. I'm done making pots. I think everybody comes to it differently. I don't think I'm ever going to be done, um, but I have started making paintings again, which feels really good. But I think everything informs, um, for me anyways, everything informs the pots. It all ends up at the pots in the end. And the sense of color is weird, because sometimes it's so liberating to just dip a pot in a glaze, be like, oh, this pot is just yellow. But when you put that yellow pot next to the pot that is, blue and green with copper fuming that turns pink, those two things are doing something with one another, you know? And that's why I think it's important for people who even aren't selling their work, but are trying to develop work, to the point where they maybe one day want to sell it, is to think about their pots in groups, and not just as an isolated pot. I mean, I think it's beautiful. Like, I saw your work a couple weeks ago at the clay studio, and wow, like, I was just kind of blown away. I mean, not to, like,
Thanks, man.
yeah, not to embarrass you a little bit, but it was like, this is it. Like, just to see the progression, not that your pots like weren't there 2 years ago, but just to see the progression of an idea and how you can take it to the next, keep going to that next level is why we keep going. And to see colors toned down and used in a way, and to see how pattern works with a form, to me, is like the hardest thing to do. Like, to paint flowers on a pot, or paint any kind of decoration on a pot, and to get that I mean, I think that's why people are so drawn to Michael Simon's work. That it has to be the
Yeah.
level of perfection, and he wouldn't think it was there, but like, because we're all our own worst critic. But the level of, when you look at like how that bird, or that, you know grid pattern, or trees, is compositionally arranged on that pot, and it just nails it nails people. Certain people's pots do that. Your pots do that for people, but certain people's pots do it for people in mass. And you're like, wow. Like, bandana pottery is another pots that you can think of, that you're just like, wow, like, not even like jealous of like the amount of pots they can sell, but just like, you just think like, wow, look at how they're communicating with so many people in this way, you know? Like, that's amazing to me.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Well, I'm glad you brought up Michael Simon because I actually want to end our conversation thinking about pricing. And I remember years ago we talked about scouring eBay to try to find Michael Simon pots before. I mean, they were expensive, but like now, that last show at Schaller, I think they're like, $8,000 for a box and $2,000 for a plate. So I want to think about the way you work now relative to the price you charge for the pot. So like Michael Simon would sit down and he would make like a jug, a bowl, a mug. He worked in a very unusual way. He didn't make 6 bowls at a time and decorate 6 bowls. He made, a lot of different forms and then decorate those each day. And then the next day he would do it again. And I see the way that you work now as being different than the way you did with the porcelain work. Because you'll sit down and you'll throw 10 or 12 bowls, but only 3 of them will look the same. And then the next 3 will look the same. And then the next 3 will work the same. So within a set of 12, you actually have a ton of variation within. And you had actually posted, I'm going to read this quote. This is a Philip Guston quote that you had put on Instagram, if I can find it now. And it was about taking detours. Do you remember this quote?
I do. Yeah. Cause I had probably just read the book about it. And his work, like when I really dug into him, and I'll talk for a minute, maybe you'll pull it up. It's like, wow, like he works like a potter. Like when you look at the breadth of his work over the span of like years at a time, and you see a certain form language, whether it's the head or just a hand coming in from the right with holding a cigarette, or weird objects or a mug he uses a lot. Like he's just like at his table painting and looking around at the objects around him. And then those become like a symbology. Those become a form language that he can then play with in the work. And everybody works differently, and that resonated with me so much. Those detours and giving yourself the freedom to explore within the parameters that you set. Like we as potters always talk about parameters and how, within that space, there's infinite possibility. And, and I believe that to be true. I remember, I think Jane Schellenbarger's like artist statements used to seem so important like 10 or 15 years ago. I don't even know if people read them anymore. But like her artist statement talked about parameters, I remember, and just like this idea of like having like a vocabulary and a language of form to work within. For me, I work towards my wired sensibility. Like I think we all need to understand how we work and then, use that to our benefit. Often when I'm teaching, people are making pots, then they get to the glazing and they're completely lost. And for me, if you're not thinking about glazing or creating little steps along the way that are going to create or that are going to tell you or give you hints as to how you're going to glaze, that's why you're confused. Because, most often what I'm doing when I'm making pots, whether I'm throwing plates and then applying slip and then, doing, using little, a foam brush or a bristle brush or my fingers. And then I'm going from plate to plate, and every plate is a different gesture or a different you know, variation on a theme, what I'm doing is saying, okay, there's going to be a pink color here. I'm not obviously choosing these colors at that time, but there's going to be green here, blue there, yellow there. Like I know that those spaces are going to be broken up with color. So, while my work looks wildly complex, like we just a month ago we had the Hudson Valley Pottery Tour, and I had Jen Allen and Lindsay Osterritter here. Lindsay's pots are amazing. I swoon over Lindsay's pots. Jen, to me, uh, is one of the greatest makers that have ever graced the planet. Like her ability to move wet clay is like no one else I've ever seen. But like Lindsay was like shocked. Like she sees the buckets in my studio and the test tiles and was like, "You use all these glazes?" Like, and she can get a range of like mood and tone with the one glaze and with the three slips she uses throughout her kiln. And I could probably do that too with a handful of glazes, but like it's just not how I operate. Like I see a pot and I think, oh wow, like yeah, this is good, but it could use a highlight of yellow here potentially, or whatever, you know, wherever my mind goes with it, I have to see it through. I can't not follow that curiosity. And then that curiosity plays out on the work. And then I have to sell that work because that's the work I made. Like like it could be called prototyping. I could be in a constant state of prototyping because I always think like, oh wow, this one pot could be a body of work. Right? I could make hundreds of this one pot and then go and display that at a show, and that's going to look really good. But I can't do it. I can't stop there. Like, and so yeah, so when I make a board of pots, let's say I sit down and I wedge up. My normal thing is I wedge up 20 balls of clay, maybe are a pound and an ounce, and that's a mug, 1 pound, 1 ounce. And some of them are taller than others, some of them are wider than others, some of them have you know, deeper trimmed feet. Some of the feet are just shallow trimmed, but all of them are going to get a glaze on the bottom. I kind of know, and all of them are going to be trimmed because I love to trim and I want the pot to be, elevated a little bit. I need to get, I'm not the type of potter, and I have lots of pots. I'm drinking out of them now. This is a 2003 Ayumi cup that's just cut right off the wheel, and you can see the wire mark on the bottom, and it's one of my favorite mugs. It's one of the original monkey mugs, and it's got a crack, but the coffee stays in it. But I can't wire a pot off the wheel and leave it. I have to. To me, the process of trimming a pot is a process of putting that final uh, refinement around the base and around, even if I have to trim the sides of it. Often pots look like they have thrown lines in them. Some of my newer pots like thrown, but those are trimmed in, right? On the side of a pot. Uh, and now I had mentioned earlier in the talk that I've reclaimed. I don't know if I said it like this, but I've reclaimed my life in a lot of ways in moving to this newer body of work. Um, you know, the work is still labor intensive, right? I'm still putting multiple glazes on a pot. I'm still dipping pots in slip. I'm still trimming everything. I'm carving and putting pattern on things. The textural qualities of my work are super important to me. Um, color relationships are super important to me. Um, but uh, I guess the being sort of hunched over, with a porcelain pot that's been waxed that I'm carving little lines into and then going to paint inlay into and then sponge it off. That level of, I guess, just uh and it's symbolic too, because the way I was sitting was so tense and so, you know, sort of um, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of, yeah, there was like a tension there. There was a tension in the work. There was a tension in me that now I throw standing. Every pot that I make, I'm moving around the room. I don't have a chair. I, I do trim, but now I trim on a Randall kick wheel. So I needed to unplug. My trimming is totally unplugged, as I would call it. And you can feel that in the work, I think. You can, um, and there's a more, I feel like, community-based thinking in the making and in the final product. Like when people buy my pots now, they're not just buying one little world to explore in like $130 mug. They're buying, a 75 or an $80 mug that, they might get two of, or they might get a bowl and a mug, or they might get a stack of plates, you know, and, and when I say I've reclaimed my life, it means that on a very practical level, I'm not in the studio from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 and doing dinner and bedtime with my kids and homework stuff, and then going back in the studio from 8 to 12 because I've got pots under plastic that need to be inlaid that are gnawing at me, because they're not going to be the right consistency tomorrow or whatever. Now I'm trimming, very groggy clay that likes to be trimmed, and I could almost wedge my trimmings back up, and like, and the pots might, I throw 10 pots in the morning and trim them that afternoon, so there's a speed at which the work has been making, or an ease, I think what it is, and that doesn't mean it's easy. That's the kind of thing when people see people who have been making pots for 40 years. I've been making pots for 20 years now, but when you see someone who's been making work for such a long time and you're like, it looks so easy, but it's not easy. It's just they're doing it with such ease because every mark is like a dancer who's been dancing for 30 years, or a musician, or somebody who's been playing guitar so long. It sounds easy, it looks easy. I mean, it might even be simple in its execution, but the ease at which it's being made at is because of that deep investigation that happens over time. And for me, I just love playing with form. Like when I throw a board of mugs, if the foot on the one that I just made flares out, the next one might just be like a simple cylinder as a reaction to that one, or if the foot flares out and then it flares into a round shape, which comes up into, then like sort of the shape changes direction. Maybe somebody might see a medieval, 400-year-old English mug, but to me, it's like I just reacted to the thing I made before. Yeah, I mean, yes, those pots are in my head, you know, but like it's really just me moving through ideas in a way that makes me feel most comfortable. We're not really getting into like, what the work means, but I think that's a greater question. I think that is, after selling pots for so many years, I don't even think that really matters anymore. Like, because I could mean to make a butter dish and then somebody could mean to put jewelry in it,
Sure.
you know? Yeah, and pots are mean so much. Like, and now that I'm making paintings again, and and they're really just color studies. They're super um based in, like, the interaction of color by Joseph Albers, and just really trying to explore color with acrylic paint so that I can, inform my pots in a different way, and also decorate my house. But like, thinking about like the meaning of painting and like also the purposelessness of it, like it's on a wall, it serves me intellectually, it's beautiful, it, you know it has profound meaning, but it also is doing nothing. Um, and so, pots, that's where when I crossed over into pots from painting 20 years ago, it's like, wow, like I can explore my painting uh, habit and tendencies, but I can do it on something that somebody's gonna like, but on these objects that are gonna creep up on people, over time. And that's super cool because you have pots, I'm sure, in your collection, and I do, that might get buried in the cupboard or up on a shelf. And then you'll look up and be like, oh, yeah, grab that one. And then I'll use that pot for days in a row. I'll keep washing it and just using it over and over and be like, how did I forget about you? Wow, you're so important to me now, and you were just sitting there collecting dust for the last 7 years. Um, you know, and lately I've been using a lot of my own pots, but then um, because I think that's important too for us to use our own work because then we really can dig in, and see it from that experiential level that often gets neglected in the academic um, critical setting where you're looking at pots and trying to break them down aesthetically and all that. Using pots are super super important as we all know. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I can ramble. I'm a good rambler.
Well,
But
that's the name of the show. So you're
yeah,
you're,
yeah.
you're
There you
welcome
go.
to ramble here.
Perfect. Yeah.
To wrap up, can you plug either your social media or website and any events you want to plug in the next couple months?
Yeah, sure. The Hudson Valley Pottery Tour is something I created and organized. It happens every third weekend in October. Of course, that's quite a ways away, but if you're ever in the Hudson Valley area, it's an amazing event, super educational. Other potters on the tour are just well, they're my heroes and heroines. So, and then also my website is dougpeltzman.com. Instagram is at Doug Peltzman. I just finished a show in DC. What's coming up? Just my own holiday sale I'll have on my website probably in a couple weeks. If anybody needs some gifts for the holidays, um, and I'm probably neglecting to say something that's coming up, but follow me and you can figure it out. Appreciate being here, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, and just to follow up with you, I think what you're doing is so amazing. Just as far as a catalog for our field, uh, and I love your work so much. So
Thanks, man.
yeah, thank
Well,
you,
I appreciate that.
thank you. Take care, bud.
I'd like to thank Doug for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with him about his work. If you'd like to shop his holiday sale, that's going to be coming up soon. You can find that at dougpeltzman.com. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. We are looking for sponsors for 2024, so if you're interested in sponsoring an episode on this show, or any of the ones that we produce on the Brickyard Network, you can get in touch through our website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network. an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.